The call came just after lunch, right as I was staring out of the 20th floor window of Echelon Global's Midtown office, watching the world churn beneath me. The traffic, the people, the ceaseless motion of a city that never stops to consider who just lost their footing. I thought it might be Brielle checking in about dinner plans or maybe dropping a hint about where she wanted to go for our anniversary, some new place with sculpted plates and 12-course menus that charged extra for air. But when I answered, I heard it in her voice before she even spoke. The smirk. "We're downsizing," she said, sharp and breezy, like she was commenting on the weather. "Today's your last day, unless you want to stay on as janitor. Floors need mopping." Behind her, I heard Myra's unmistakable cackle. Cold. Cruel. Loud enough that she wanted me to hear. That meant it wasn't just business. It was personal. My wife's sister had hated me since the day I stopped paying for her Pilates classes and called her out for borrowing one of Brielle's business cards to expense a vacation. She was the type who smiled at funerals, mostly to check out who was grieving harder than her. I stared at the skyline, forcing my voice to stay even. "Thanks for the amazing offer." Brielle laughed like she'd won something. And maybe she thought she had. In her mind, it was probably some final blow. After all, she was the queen now. CEO of a global firm, wearing tailored power suits and clinking glasses with venture capitalists who didn't care what lives they steamrolled. She had the title, the spotlight, the nameplate on the mahogany door, and apparently enough pettiness to fire her own husband like an intern with poor hygiene. But she didn't know what I knew. She didn't know about the fallback plan I'd been nurturing like a quiet ember in the back of my mind for months. She didn't know about the private studio apartment I kept across town, the one where I did my real work, the kind of work Echelon ran on, the kind of work she paraded around as hers in board meetings. She didn't know that while she was busy stepping over people to pose for glossy magazine interviews, I was building something no publicist could spin, no press release could capture. And she sure as hell didn't know that the reason she could even hold her head high in those shareholder meetings was because of the predictive analytics engine I'd coded, refined, and perfected. An engine that was never formally transferred to Echelon in any signed document. It lived in their systems, but it had my fingerprint all over it. And now, I was the only one who could truly navigate its core without capsizing the entire ship. "I wouldn't bother coming home either," Brielle added casually. "We've changed the locks." Myra said it was time. She didn't hang up immediately. She waited. Like she wanted to hear me crack, to scream or beg or lash out with the kind of desperation that would prove her superiority. But I didn't give her that. I never had. That was part of what made her hate me toward the end. I didn't need her money, and that was an unforgivable crime in Brielle's world. So I simply said, "You've made yourself very clear," and hung up. I sat there for a moment longer, breathing through the silence that followed. The office around me was quiet. Too quiet. As if the building had been instructed to shun me in real time. The digital clock on the corner of my desk kept blinking 12:53. My hands were still on the phone. But inside, something had shifted. I stood up and looked around. The desk I'd once cherished was now just another hollow space with a surface littered with memos, deadlines, and empty coffee cups that symbolized wasted hours. A framed photo of us, Brielle and me, smiling at Lake Como 2 years ago, sat near my monitor. I picked it up, held it for half a second, and then flipped it face down. Let them think they'd humiliated me. The truth? They'd just opened the gate. I took one last glance around my office. No speeches. No long email goodbyes. I didn't need to broadcast what I already knew. The version of me they thought they were firing wasn't the man who was walking out of here. The real me had been sitting dormant, quiet in the corners, waiting. And now, he was wide awake. I slid my phone into my coat pocket, picked up my laptop, and opened one specific folder, one that only I could access with a biometric key I'd coded myself. A heartbeat sensor tied to my Apple Watch, a redundancy system that bypassed firewalls, and a self-erasing algorithm if anyone but me touched it. I smiled at the screen. It still worked. Then I deleted it. The core script. The untraceable, original kernel of the analytics system that powered every major decision Echelon made. The framework still existed on their servers, but without this piece, it would slowly become inaccurate, then unreliable, then useless. A digital time bomb. It wouldn't explode immediately. It would unravel. A 0.25% missed here, a projected growth curve that didn't match results, a partner who lost confidence after one too many wrong data points. No one would know exactly what went wrong, but I would. I closed the laptop, slid it into its sleeve, and picked up the only other thing I cared about in the room, a small, leather-bound notebook tucked inside a locked drawer. My notes, my plans, my freedom. As I walked down the hallway, no one looked at me. The receptionist averted her eyes. The HR manager I used to help prep presentations suddenly found her phone very interesting. But one person did meet my gaze. Damon, a junior analyst I'd mentored since his first internship. He stood at the corner, eyes wide, confusion and sadness written all over his face. I gave him a small nod. He nodded back. That was enough. In the elevator, I finally exhaled. I was free. And Brielle? She thought she'd played the final card. But the game had only just begun. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and I stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Echelon Global for what would be the last time. Not that anyone would have guessed. I wasn't dragging a box of personal effects. I wasn't red-faced or weeping into my tie. No storming. No dramatic outburst. Just a quiet walk toward the end of something I had helped build with my bare hands and better intentions. The silence in that lobby was a language of its own. Subtle, suffocating. The receptionist, Marcy, looked up from her desk. Her hand hovered mid-air over the keyboard, then quickly dropped as if she hadn't seen me, as if ignoring me might undo the moment. I didn't blame her. She was just another foot soldier trying not to step on landmines. Word must have traveled fast, eh? Brielle's empire was efficient like that. She didn't just fire people. She erased them. Clean breaks, no fingerprints. I'm sure by now, the official story was that I'd stepped down to pursue creative interests. I could practically hear her PR team polishing the statement. I took my time walking past the glass panels that lined the hallway. Through them, I saw bits and pieces of a world I once cared about. Rooms where I'd brainstormed late into the night, crunched numbers that no one else could decode, and coded entire systems that had become the lifeblood of the company. People looked up from their desks curious. I saw a few stiffen. A few ducked their heads. One or two offered tentative nods. There was no spoken farewell. But I saw something else in their eyes. Not pity, no. Something more rattling. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of what this meant. If I could be discarded, someone who'd once shared the corner office with the queen herself, what did that say about their own security? Their own worth? I didn't slow down. I turned right into the elevator vestibule, past the break room, where someone had left behind half a donut on a paper towel. Strange what your brain picks up when everything's ending. I pressed the button and waited, hearing the soft whirring of cables behind the walls. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, then hesitant. I didn't turn around until a voice spoke. Mason. I turned. Damon. The junior analyst I'd mentored. Smart. Observant. Loyal in a way I hadn't expected anyone to be in that building anymore. His tie was slightly askew, and his brow was creased with concern. I just heard, he said. Is it true? I offered a small smile. Define true. He looked stunned for a moment. You're really leaving? I was invited to mop floors, I said dryly. But I declined the promotion. He laughed nervously, not sure if it was a joke or not. He stepped closer, voice lowered. This doesn't feel right. You are Echelon. Everyone knows that, even if they won't say it out loud. I'm not Echelon, I said quietly. Not anymore. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. I stepped inside, then turned to him as he hovered, unsure whether to follow or stay behind. I could see it in his eyes, questions he wanted to ask but didn't have the courage to voice. Not yet. If I were you, I said gently, I'd start polishing my resume. Sooner rather than later. He nodded once. It wasn't just gratitude. It was understanding. The doors closed. Down I went, each floor a small exhale, a memory passing. The late-night pizza sessions. The strategic planning meetings that turned into marital arguments behind closed doors. The celebratory drinks after quarterly wins, where Brielle toasted the team and I smiled quietly, knowing the engine behind the numbers was sitting in my hard drive. By the time the elevator reached the ground floor, I had shed every layer of pride I'd once tied to that place. My nameplate was already gone, my keycard disabled. But I didn't feel powerless. I felt lighter. Outside, the city hadn't changed. The sidewalks still pulsed with urgency. Horns blared. Tourists snapped photos near the fountains. I stood on the curb with my laptop case slung over my shoulder and my coat collar turned up against the early wind. I didn't call a car. I walked. Not aimlessly, deliberately. 8 blocks later, I reached the Echelon Data Center. A nondescript building wrapped in slate gray panels and obscured behind code-locked doors. I still had one last credential, an analog one. The security guard, an older man named Lester who'd once shared stories about his daughter's softball games, looked up from his newspaper. "Hey, Mr. Mason. Didn't know you were stopping by today?" "Just grabbing a few old backups," I said with an easy grin. He shrugged and buzzed me through. Inside the server room, I moved quickly. No hesitation. I went straight to Terminal C, an old console only a few of us ever used. I plugged in my encrypted flash drive, bypassed the front-facing protocols, and navigated to a buried data cache. Not just files, architecture, frameworks, logs that told stories Brielle never even knew were being written. I didn't take them. I didn't need to. I simply deleted one very specific decryption script, a private key that validated thousands of real-time transactions between Echelon and its AI recommendation engine. It would take them weeks to realize what was wrong. By then, clients would start losing trust. Decision metrics would start faltering. And it would all trace back to a ghost script, one I had just erased. I removed the flash drive, wiped the terminal's cache, and left. Outside, the clouds had thickened. A light drizzle kissed the top of my head. I didn't rush. I took the subway downtown, to the studio apartment Brielle never knew existed. A 400-square-foot space tucked above a bookstore, with peeling paint and bad insulation, but privacy no one could touch. Inside, I took off my coat, dropped my bag, and opened a drawer in the corner desk. There it was, the black notebook. Not a journal, not memories, blueprints, plans, codes, names, concepts. It was the foundation of everything I never shared, never trusted anyone with, not even Brielle. Especially not her. I sat down, flipped to the last page I'd written on, and picked up the pen that had been waiting for this moment. They thought they'd humiliated me. Truth was, they'd set me free. The studio apartment was nothing special to anyone else, a narrow room tucked above a bookstore, with creaky floorboards, chipped molding, and a radiator that hissed like it was in constant protest. But to me, it was sanctuary. Freedom. The one place left that was mine and mine alone. No keycard access, no security cameras, no boardroom eyes tracking my every move. Brielle had never stepped foot here. Hell, she didn't even know it existed, which made it the most valuable real estate I had. I kicked off my shoes, tossed my coat over the sagging arm of a worn leather chair, and walked to the desk in the corner, the one that looked like it belonged in a hacker's lair more than an ex-executive's safe house. I slid open the bottom drawer, fingers brushing past a stack of prepaid SIM cards and USB drives until they landed on the black notebook. It wasn't labeled. No names. No logos. Just matte leather and thread binding worn from constant flipping. This notebook wasn't just a backup. It was the real master key. My insurance. I opened it slowly, like a ritual, and the pages bloomed with diagrams, equations, and notes scrawled in tiny, precise handwriting. Charts mapping Echelon's core algorithms. Frameworks I'd coded by hand over the last 5 years. Adjustments no one else could even begin to interpret. Every line of logic, every predictive model that powered their proprietary engine, they all started here. With me. Brielle never asked how the engine worked. Never asked about rights or authorship. Why would she? I was her husband. The man in the shadows who made the magic happen so she could take center stage. She'd been too busy dressing up our story for investors to worry about the fine print. The irony was poetic. She built a fortress on sand and never once stopped to test the ground beneath her heels. And now, I had a choice. I could destroy Echelon from the outside with a single coordinated leak. A few emails, a handful of internal documents, and a demo of how unstable their projections were without my code would be enough to trigger an internal audit and a public relations disaster. But that wasn't what I wanted. Revenge wasn't the point. Not really. I wanted to build something better. I flipped to the tab section marked Nova. That was the code name I'd given to the project, the one I'd been sketching out in the stolen hours between midnight and dawn, long before Brielle ever picked up her first investor. Nova wasn't just another analytics tool. It was the next generation. A self-learning, ethics-compliant intelligence engine that adjusted its projections based not only on market behavior, but on sentiment, socioeconomic variance, and individual context. Something more human. I ran a hand through my hair and pulled my laptop onto the desk. No Echelon servers. No dependencies. This system lived locally. I powered it up and watched the Nova interface bloom across the screen. Smooth, clean, elegant. The login screen pulsed gently. I tapped in my credentials and was greeted with a quiet chime. "Welcome back, Mason." 3 new messages blinked in the corner of the dashboard. I clicked through them. The first was from a hedge fund in Singapore that had heard whispers about a new black box product being quietly tested among independent VCs. The second was a meeting request from an executive at Hyperion DataWorks, a former Echelon client I suspected would be very interested in what Nova could offer. And the third was from someone unexpected. Alton Morrow, CEO of Luminar Ventures. A man who'd once called me a quiet genius during a panel discussion on the future of AI in business. He was one of the few people who saw me, not just the public version of me Betrayal used like a trophy husband, but the actual thinker behind the curtain. The message was simple. Heard what happened. If you're ready to build, we should talk. Coffee? My office. No suits, no games. You pick the day. I stared at the message for a long moment, then opened a tab and looked at the calendar. This wasn't luck. It was alignment. A signal that the path I'd drawn wasn't a fantasy. It was real. Achievable. I stood and walked to the window. The city stretched before me, sprawling and indifferent, lit up like a living organism. Somewhere in that maze of steel and light, Brielle was probably sipping champagne with Myra, celebrating their little coup. Maybe she thought I was crying in a hotel lobby or begging some attorney for a bridge loan. Let her think that. I sipped cold coffee left from earlier that morning and returned to my desk. I started assembling a folder. Not just code vision. A roadmap. What Nova could do, what it would cost, who it could serve, and how it would redefine what data intelligence meant in the next 5 years. This wasn't just about proving I could survive without her. It was about proving I was always the one driving the engine. By midnight, the outline was complete. I packaged the folder into an encrypted file and set up a meeting invite for Alton Morrow Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. No suits, no games, just 2 people who understood the battlefield. I stared at the invite for a moment before hitting send. Then I leaned back, arms behind my head, letting the tension ease out of my spine. The world had shifted, but I hadn't collapsed under it. In fact, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Not because I had a team behind me or a corporation cushioning my fall, but because I had clarity. Brielle thought she'd cut me off from everything that mattered. What she'd really done was hand me the match while standing in a house of paper. The real work began now. And this time, the empire I built wouldn't have her name anywhere near it. Alton Morrow didn't do small talk. That was the first thing anyone in the tech space learned when they crossed his path. He was blunt, unfiltered, and terrifyingly intelligent. The kind of man who made power moves in jeans and loafers, who could glance at a dashboard and know which direction the market would lurch 3 quarters from now. If Brielle was the queen of flash and posturing, Alton was the architect of substance. That's why I picked him. I didn't make an appointment. I didn't send an email. I just showed up. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Kyla, raised an eyebrow when I walked into the glass-paneled reception area of Luminar Ventures, holding nothing but a black thumb drive in my palm and a look that said I wasn't here to beg. She looked me over, then picked up her phone and whispered something. A beat later, she nodded once and pointed down the hall. He said clear as schedule. Go on in. Alton's office wasn't showy. No marble. No abstract art hung, just to impress. Just a long window view of the skyline and a single desk, steel, clean, precise. The man himself was leaning against the window frame, sleeves rolled up, a ceramic mug in one hand, and a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. I figured you'd come eventually, he said, voice low and cool. Didn't think it'd be this soon. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and held up the thumb drive like an offering. I've got something to show you. No strings. Just facts. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Then show me. I plugged in the drive, opened the encrypted folder, and let Nova speak for itself. First, the framework, an interface that visualized behavior patterns not just by raw data points, but by emotional resonance, sociopolitical context, and trust weighting. Then the model's self-correcting engine, coded to recognize its own blind spots and retrain in real time without human prompt. Finally, the projection module, how Nova could forecast market shifts not just based on metrics, but by anticipating human decision patterns days, even weeks, ahead. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just watched, eyes sharp and unwavering. When the final module closed, he leaned back and whistled. You built this. Every line of code, I said. And you're telling me this didn't come from Echelon? I never signed over IP rights, I replied. Everything they use is a shadow of this. A half-baked version built off my early drafts. He tilted his head. And Brielle? She doesn't know. She thinks she burned the bridge, I said. But she forgot I built the river first. He let that hang in the air for a long moment. Then he smiled, just enough to show teeth. You could break them. I met his gaze. I could build something better. He nodded slowly. Now that's a better game. Alton stood and circled around the desk, hands in his pockets. You know, when I first met you, you were the guy standing behind her at those expos, adjusting her mic, watching the screens. Quiet, polite. She called you her support system. Said you were brilliant, but not business-minded. She never minded my mind when it paid for her first office lease. I said, voice calm. Alton chuckled. Well, she's about to learn the hard way what happens when the support system goes solo. He sat on the edge of the desk. Let's talk about rollout. About funding. I've got a team of engineers who can work in a blackout zone. A legal department that can draw circles around her before she even gets out of bed. And I've got capital, Mason. Real capital. I nodded. I want autonomy. No shadow control. I'm not handing over another brainchild to someone else's ego. You won't, he said. You'll be the face this time. And the hands. And the spine. I exhaled slowly. Then we moved now. We talked for 2 more hours. About strategy, about deployment, about how to build something that wasn't just a reaction to Echelon, but a complete paradigm shift. Not a clone. Not a copy. A challenger. One rooted in everything Echelon had lost. Real trust, real transparency, real ingenuity. By the time I left his office, the sun had dipped below the skyline. The city was shifting into its twilight rhythm, but I walked differently now. No longer as the discarded husband Brielle thought she'd exiled, but as the man who had built the bones of an empire and was now drafting something stronger from scratch. Outside the building, I paused under a flickering street lamp, the air sharp with the smell of rain and ambition. I pulled out my phone and opened an old folder of Echelon press clippings, photos of Brielle at launches, and panel discussions, in luxury hotels giving statements about innovation and legacy. Always her name. Always her smile. My fingerprints hidden behind the velvet curtain. Not anymore. I tapped the screen and started a new document. A list of names. Engineers, analysts, strategists. People I had mentored, collaborated with, or quietly supported behind the scenes, many of them now disillusioned or outright discarded by Echelon. The cast-offs. The ignored. The ones who built the foundation but were never invited to the top floor. They'd be the first ones I called. They knew the truth. And they were hungry to build again with someone who saw them. I walked 2 blocks to a late-night diner, ordered coffee, and opened my laptop right there under the buzz of cheap lights and old vinyl booths. The Nova framework was already humming. I pulled up a new interface and began outlining what we'd need for Phase 1. Server load testing. Private beta clients. Legal architecture for ownership and release rights. I didn't need to destroy Brielle to win. All I had to do was give people something real to believe in. Something she could never offer. Something I'd always held in my hands. It was easy to forget how many people Brielle had discarded on her way up. She wore ambition like armor, sharp and shining, and she didn't mind stepping over bodies to get to the next stage. But the thing about discarded people is, they remember. They talk. And when someone finally shows up with a different kind of plan, one that doesn't involve egos and power plays but respect and opportunity, they show up too. My mornings started early now. No corporate commute, no tailored suits or sterile boardrooms. Just black coffee, a plain t-shirt, and a whiteboard already littered with diagrams and timelines before the sun fully rose. The studio apartment transformed overnight into a nerve center. Cables snaked across the floor, laptops hummed with simulations, and empty takeout boxes were stacked like trophies. It was messy. It was human. It was real. And it was working. Within days of my meeting with Alton, things began to move. Not in the flashy, PR-heavy way Echelon liked to operate, but in a way that had weight. Quiet meetings in co-working spaces. Midnight video calls with engineers in Berlin, Toronto, Sao Paulo. People I had once worked beside in the trenches, now eager to join a movement instead of a machine. They were tired of being cogs. I gave them keys. Nova was no longer just a concept. It was breathing, learning, iterating. Every day we added new layers. A modular trust algorithm. A consumer-side transparency panel that would let clients see exactly how their data was used. No more black box. No more guesswork. If Echelon was flash and illusion, Nova would be fire and glass, bright, hot, and impossible to fake. But building the engine was only one part of it. I needed people, not just programmers and coders, but storytellers, strategists, people who could see past the numbers and understand what Nova meant for the world. That's when I called Marin. She had once been Echelon's lead UX designer, until Brielle sidelined her in a reorg that replaced talent with trend chasers. Marin had an instinct for experience, a sixth sense for what users needed before they could articulate it. I sent her a simple message: "Let me show you something worth believing in." She replied with 3 words: "Send the address." When she arrived, her eyes scanned the chaos of my apartment turn lab, and instead of flinching, she grinned. "Looks like you're actually doing it." I nodded. "Want to help build something better?" Marin rolled up her sleeves and joined without a second question. One by one, they came. People Brielle had pushed aside, bought out, or overlooked. Not because they weren't talented, but because they made the mistake of not worshiping her. We called ourselves Project Lantern, because we weren't here to burn bridges or burn down old empires. We were here to illuminate the path forward. By the 3rd week, I had 15 full-time team members and 3 venture meetings scheduled. Alton stayed hands-off, just as he promised, but I felt his support in the rooms he opened and the names he whispered in the right ears. Still, it wasn't just about the launch or the product. There was a deeper satisfaction in reclaiming something that had once been mine: my voice, my identity, my damn name. I started reaching out to former Echelon clients, not to poach, but to explain. Some didn't pick up. Some listened, curious but hesitant. But a few asked questions. The right ones. And I answered with clarity, without bitterness, and backed by facts. I showed them what Echelon's predictive system had been doing over the last 6 months, how its accuracy was declining, how it was recommending suboptimal targets, how the very algorithm they trusted was degrading from the inside. And then I showed them Nova. Not the full system, just enough to make their eyes widen. A prototype demo, real-time sentiment mapping, ethical guardrails that could be audited. One exec, a woman named Cassie from a major retail platform, leaned forward after a 30-minute Zoom and said, "Mason, this is going to change everything. When can I get on the beta list?" I didn't need 1,000,000 customers. I needed 10 who believed in what we were doing. But even as we built upward, I couldn't ignore the past. Not because I was stuck in it, but because it still had my fingerprints all over it. So I made an appointment with a law firm Alton's people recommended. I walked in with my notebook, my laptop, and my thumb drive. I left with something much more valuable: a fully registered patent, my name, my code, time-stamped, ironclad. I didn't rush to use it. I didn't run to the press. That was Brielle's style. I tucked it away, quiet, ready, because I knew the time was coming. While I met with engineers and brainstormed UI frameworks with Marin, I kept an ear to the ground. I saw the whispers online, forums where developers discussed how Echelon's output was acting weird or not matching the model accuracy anymore. I watched as minor influencers, the kind Echelon used to pride themselves on swaying, began to talk about other options. New players, open systems, better data ethics. Brielle was still doing interviews, still hosting her champagne mixers, still laughing on stages in her silk dresses and buzzwords. But underneath it all, I could see the cracks forming. That's what happens when you build a throne on people's backs and forget that one day, they might all stand up. One night, around 2 a.m., I was sitting on my windowsill, nursing the last of my coffee, when Meyer's name popped up in a news alert. Echelon expands into wearable data tracking. Privacy concerns raised by tech watchdogs. I laughed out loud. Because of course they were doubling down on invasion disguised as innovation. But it was coming. Soon, she'd be sitting at a table she didn't even realize I'd set. Soon, she'd see that the man she thought she erased had never stopped writing. He just picked a better pen. And it would be my signature, mine, that marked the beginning of her end. The conference room was all sharp lines and silence. Glass walls, chrome finishes, matte black leather chairs spaced around a sleek obsidian table that looked like it belonged in a Bond villain's lair. It didn't smell like money, it reeked of it. Fresh cut wood. Espresso. Some subtle cologne engineered to convey dominance. I'd been in rooms like this before, but always beside Brielle. Never across from her. Never opposite. Today was different. 12 people sat at that table, men and women who could write 8-figure checks without blinking. They didn't come for pleasantries. They came for vision. for opportunity, for power. And I had all three. At the head of the table, I stood beside Alton Morrow, who introduced me not as former echelon executive or tech architect, but simply the man building the future. He knew what he was doing. Words matter in rooms like these. He didn't want them seeing me as Brielle's shadow. He wanted them to see me as the light. A presentation played behind us. Marin's design, simple, bold, elegant. Nova's interface moved like liquid glass across the screen, cycling through demo slides, real-time trust metrics, adaptive behavior models, full transparency audits. I didn't pitch like Brielle used to. No buzzwords, no ego, no pretense. I told the truth. We're not selling you a product, I said. We're offering you a foundation. The systems most of you currently use are aging beneath the surface. They're brittle. They're optimized for performance metrics that are outdated before the quarter ends. Nova isn't just predictive, it's perceptive. It's built to understand behavior as it happens, not after the fact. They leaned in. Some nodded. One jotted something in a leather notebook. Then the doors opened, and the air shifted. The click of heels. Confident. Sharp. Measured. Brielle. Draped in navy blue silk, jaw locked tight, lips pressed into a blade of a smile. Her assistant, some blonde kid who looked like he was barely out of business school, followed 2 steps behind, whispering urgently. She ignored him. When she saw me at the front of the room, her stride faltered for half a beat. Just half. But I caught it. Everyone did. She hadn't known I'd be here. Her eyes swept the table, landing on Alton, then flicking to the screen where Nova's logo rotated like a quiet warning. Mason, she said. I turned slowly, keeping my posture relaxed, my voice calm. Brielle. Didn't expect to see you here. It wasn't mockery. It was precision. I met her with the same cool detachment she'd once used to fire me over the phone. The room waited. Every breath held like glass about to crack. She started, but Alton cut in smoothly. Perfect timing, Brielle. We were just walking through the core differentiators between legacy analytics platforms and Mason's Nova system. Fascinating stuff. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then recovered. She smiled that press-friendly smile and stepped forward, voice lacquered in charm. Well, I'm sure it is, she said. But some of us still believe in the systems we already trust. Stability matters. Until it doesn't, I said. Especially when the underlying IP is compromised. Her eyes flared, barely perceptible, but enough. The others glanced between us like spectators at a high-stakes chess match. They didn't know the history, but they could feel it. Something electric. I walked slowly around the table, fingers grazing the back of a chair. I used to sit beside Brielle, I said. Built the system she rides on today. But what most of you don't know is, I never signed over the original architecture. The engine that powered Echelon's rise? The one still running their models? It was mine. Always was. A pause. The kind that chokes a room in tension. Alton leaned forward and slid a folder onto the table. Thick. Sealed. We'll be acquiring full integration rights to Nova, he said, including the underlying analytics system. Mason's engine. You could feel her mask slipping. Just slightly. Her fingers twitched. Her smile tightened. That system is proprietary, she said carefully. Only if you can prove it, I replied, reaching into my case and pulling out a second folder. I slid it across the table toward her. This might help clarify your legal exposure. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside, patent paperwork. Timestamped. Digitally certified. My name. Not hers. Not Echelon's. The silence became a living thing. Her assistant leaned over her shoulder and whispered something again. She didn't respond. I watched her jaw move, tight, grinding. She closed the folder slowly, methodically. Mason, she said, voice low now. Can we speak privately? No, I said. We're not in private anymore. Because this was the moment I'd been walking towards since that phone call. Not a scene of vengeance, but a reckoning. She'd humiliated me in front of an entire company. Locked me out of my own home. Laughed when she thought I had nowhere left to go. And now, I was standing between her and the future. A man beside me. One of the investors, a gray-bearded financier who'd built 3 tech unicorns, cleared his throat. How soon can Nova be operational? I didn't look at Brielle. I looked at him. Beta testing starts in 3 weeks, I said. Full deployment by the next quarter. He nodded. Put me down for 40 million. Another voice chimed in. Then another. Brielle didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there as commitment after commitment stacked around her like bricks. I didn't smile. I didn't need to, because I'd already won. And the best part? I hadn't needed to shout or scheme or burn it all down. All I had to do was build something worth standing behind and sit at the head of the table she never thought I'd reach. She thought the shock was seeing me at the head of the table. She thought that was the twist, Mason, the discarded husband, standing beside her biggest rival, flanked by the very investors who used to hang on her every word. She thought that was the moment where the camera would freeze, the score would rise, and the audience would gasp. But that wasn't it. That was just the opening scene. The real surprise was what came next. Brielle had remained standing long after everyone else settled back into their seats. Her expression had softened into a professional calm, but I could see the tension in her neck, the way her fingers coiled tightly around the folder I'd given her. I'd seen her wear that face during merger calls when she was bluffing with numbers she didn't fully believe. It was the same face she wore the night she convinced me to let her pitch my early prototypes under the Echelon name, just to help us get some traction, she had said. Alton tapped a finger against the folder he dropped earlier, the one detailing the Nova acquisition. As discussed, we'll be taking full integration rights, including analytics architecture, client access frameworks, and future licensing privileges. He leaned back in his chair like a man who already knew the board vote was unanimous. The valuation was finalized this morning. Brielle's voice came out tight. Valuation? $500 million, I said, casually, as if we weren't talking about $500 million worth of intelligence infrastructure. We closed the term sheet before this meeting. Someone across the table let out a low whistle. Another investor smiled to himself, already running numbers. I turned to Brielle. Her eyes were locked on me now, no longer pretending to smile. No longer playing gracious. You can't sell what belongs to Echelon. I'm not selling anything that belongs to Echelon, I said calmly. You would know that if you'd ever taken the time to understand what we were building. You remember that stack of contracts I gave you 2 years ago? The ones you handed to Myra to sort through? You never signed the transfer clause. Legally, the architecture remained mine. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her brain was trying to catch up with her pride. Alton opened his own folder and slid a second document across the table. Here's the kicker, Brielle. This deal doesn't just move us forward, it protects us retroactively. Mason's system has been running at Echelon without a signed transfer of IP rights, which means you may have unknowingly exposed your firm to unauthorized usage claims. Brielle's eyes flicked to her assistant. He looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. There's no way, she whispered. No one's ever questioned the system. Because it worked, I cut in. But only because I kept it stable from the back end. Every time your output started drifting off target, that was me fixing the code through an access key I buried in the developer log, one that expires tonight, by the way. The room went silent. She swallowed, visibly. Then, as if desperate to reassert control, she said, "We'll take this to court." "You're welcome to," I said, gesturing toward the thick folder she hadn't dared open fully yet. "That's my patent paperwork. Filed, timestamped, verified. The metadata alone proves origin. And even if you tried to dispute authorship, your own system logs, dated commits, login trails, developer notes, all point back to me. And they're already archived with my." I leaned forward. "Yes, you did. You just thought you'd be on the winning side." The investors remained silent, watching her unravel. No one was coming to her defense. No one was offering a lifeline. She wasn't the queen in this room. Not anymore. She was a name on a receding headline, and everyone here knew it. Then I pushed one final document across the table. "This is a courtesy," I said. "A full summary of Echelon's current liability, including usage of my system since the date of the unsigned transfer clause. Retroactive licensing could save you a PR crisis, provided you come to terms by Friday." Her lips moved like she wanted to argue, but there was no argument to make. The walls she'd built weren't made of steel. They were made of glass. And now the sunlight was pouring in. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You planned this." "No," I said. "You did. I just kept the receipts." It was true. Every decision she'd made. Every time she sidelined someone for daring to question her. Every contract she ignored. Every bridge she burned while I sat quietly behind her had paved the road to this moment. She was so sure she didn't need anyone else. So sure she could twist the truth into any shape she wanted. But code doesn't lie. Ownership doesn't forget. And signatures? Well, the ones that aren't signed have consequences too. Alton rose from his chair. "This meeting's adjourned. We've got contracts to finalize." The investors stood slowly, murmuring among themselves. Some glanced at Brielle with a mix of curiosity and detachment, like watching a magician caught using cheap tricks. She didn't move. Neither did I. Once the room cleared, it was just the two of us. I stood and looked down at her. You used to say I didn't understand power, I said. But I do now. Power isn't control. It's trust. It's knowing your value, even when someone else tries to erase it. She blinked quickly. The first crack of real emotion passed through her face. Why didn't you ever fight me before? She asked. Because I believed in us, I said. Even when you didn't. I walked out without looking back. The hallway felt longer than usual, but lighter too. Outside, the sun cut through the skyline like a clean blade, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost in someone else's story. This was my story now, and I had just turned the page. The call came just after midnight. I had just shut my laptop, the glow of Nova's latest interface still lingering behind my eyes, and was about to pour myself a quiet drink when the screen of my phone lit up across the table. Unknown number. But I knew. Instinctively. Some part of me recognized the weight behind the silence, the tremble in the digital air even before I answered. Hello, I said. There was a pause. Then her voice. Mason. Brielle didn't sound like herself. Gone was the confident, calculated woman who could sell sand to the desert. Her voice cracked slightly on the syllables, and for a second, I thought maybe it was an imposter. But no, there it was. That falter beneath the breath, the one I'd heard only twice before, the night her father died, and the night her IPO almost collapsed before we patched the numbers behind the scenes. You can't do this, she said quietly. You can't. Mason, we built that system together. I sat back in the armchair by the window, the city glittering faintly beyond the glass like it had no idea a war was ending inside a single conversation. We didn't build it together, I said. I built it. You branded it. You're rewriting history, she snapped, her voice sharpening. You used my connections, my platform, my capital, and I used my brain, I said flatly. We both brought something to the table, Brielle, but only one of us tried to flip the table over. She was quiet again, but I could hear her breathing. Fast, unsteady. That was rare for her. She'd made a career out of pretending nothing ever rattled her. I didn't think it would go this far, she said finally. No, I agreed. You thought I'd break. Crawl back. Settle for mopping floors while you tossed champagne on the balcony. That wasn't me, she said, like it mattered. Your voice was on the call, I said. Myra laughed in the background. And you didn't stop her. I was angry. No, I cut in. You were arrogant. There's a difference. Her silence then was telling. Waited. She knew it too. I lost sight of things, she said softer now. I kept climbing, and somewhere along the way I forgot how we started. I forgot what you gave up. That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because of how long it had taken her to admit something that had been choking me for years. You didn't forget, I said. You ignored it. There's a difference there, too. Mason, listen. No, I said again, firm now. You don't get to frame this like a misunderstanding. You fired me over the phone. You locked me out of the house I paid for. You paraded me as the tech mind behind Echelon until it stopped serving your narrative. You used my work, my trust, and my silence. She was breathing harder now. So what do you want? Is this about revenge? You've made your point. You've humiliated me, Mason. You've won. I didn't want to humiliate you, I said. If I did, I would have gone to the press with everything. I would have leaked internal documents, old emails, broken the story wide open, and made you the villain in every headline. I didn't do that. Then what do you want? She whispered. I looked out the window for a long moment. I want you to learn the difference between being powerful and being respected. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her voice was hoarse. Please, Mason, just tell me what it would take to make this go away. And there it was. The thing I never thought I'd hear from Brielle, desperation. Not the kind that clawed and fought. The kind that wilted. The kind that came after the free fall, when you realized your parachute was stitched together by ego and guesswork. It's already done, I said. Nova's secured. The contracts are signed. Your access is gone. The system you're still using will degrade until it's unusable. I've given you the courtesy of a retroactive license to avoid litigation. You can take that. Or not. She sounded smaller when she asked, and after that? After that, you figure out who you are without pretending to be the smartest person in the room. Another pause. Then, finally, you really hate me now, don't you? I closed my eyes. Not from exhaustion, but clarity. No, I said. I don't hate you. I pity you. She gasped a little at that. Maybe she'd been bracing for venom. But this cut differently. Because it was clean. Honest. I loved you, I said, the words surprisingly steady. Not the brand. Not the business partner. You. I wanted to build a life. A legacy. But you wanted something shinier. Something that needed me quiet and convenient. I let that sit. Mason. I didn't respond. I'm sorry, she whispered, and for the first time, I believed she meant it. But I didn't say anything back. Some silences are necessary. Some silences are healing. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said finally. I already did, I replied. It was never about beating you, Brielle. It was about becoming myself again. Then I ended the call. No flourish. No final blow. Just silence. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, staring at the skyline. For the first time in 2 years, I felt the quiet settle in my chest, not like a weight, but like a breath finally let out. I didn't check my inbox. I didn't revisit old files. I didn't reach for a drink to chase down the echoes. I just sat there, and I slept deep, uninterrupted, and dreamless for the first time in years. Because some battles aren't won with swords. Some are won the moment you realize you don't need to fight anymore. It didn't take long for the headlines to come. 3 days after our last conversation, the digital world cracked open. It began with a whisper. A niche tech blog published a piece titled, Echelon's engine may not be its own. It was the kind of headline most readers would scroll past. But the people who mattered? They didn't scroll. They clicked. They read. They dug deeper. By the end of the week, it wasn't just blogs. It was Techline, Business Current, The Wall Street Sentinel. Whistleblower reveals IP theft inside Echelon Global. Former CTO alleges unauthorized use of proprietary code. Predictive giant facing lawsuit over system rights. I hadn't filed a lawsuit. Not yet. But word spreads fast when the foundation is cracking. The rumor alone was enough to trigger panic. By Friday, the board called an emergency session. I didn't attend. I didn't have to. I got the play-by-play through back channels, texts from former colleagues, industry insiders, even 2 of the investors who had backed Brielle during her ascension. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Brielle was asked to step down. Effective immediately. Myra went with her. Apparently, she tried to defend Brielle during the meeting, tried to redirect the conversation toward market confidence and forward vision. But it backfired. One of the board members reportedly asked, if you're so confident, why was your sister using a system she didn't own? Myra stammered. And just like that, the show was over. There were no cameras. No dramatic walkouts. Just 2 women who had spent years building an empire of image, escorted quietly out of the building by security. I didn't cheer. I didn't celebrate. Because it wasn't a victory. Not really. It was closure. The morning after the announcement, I stood on the balcony of my new office. It wasn't enormous. It didn't need to be. It had tall windows, natural light, and the kind of quiet you earn, not purchase. My team was already buzzing downstairs. Marin was holding a design review. 2 engineers were running diagnostics, and Damon, who I'd finally invited to join Nova full-time, was fine-tuning our data hygiene protocol with a level of focus that made me proud. They were building something honest, and they trusted me to lead it. That was the real win. I sipped my coffee and watched the city hum to life. Billboards flashed. Buses roared down avenues. Somewhere, someone else was getting blindsided by betrayal, by ego, by the kind of miscalculation that costs more than money. But not me. Not anymore. At noon, an email landed in my inbox. Subject: Lock access termination confirmation. It was from a security firm I'd hired weeks ago, the day after Brielle changed the locks on what had been our home. The email was brief. Per your request, all biometric and keycard access to the former residence has been disabled. Systems have been rekeyed to your private signature. You are now the sole property owner on record. I read it twice. Not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to feel what that truly meant. The locks they changed to keep me out? They were guarding nothing worth keeping. The house was a shell now. She had left it behind when the board ousted her. My attorney handled the paperwork quietly, transferring the deed after an unpaid tax violation surfaced. Echelon had covered a lot of Brielle's personal costs. Once that dam broke, the unraveling was swift. I could have sold the house. I still might. But for now, it stood as a quiet monument. Not to what we lost, but to what I survived. Later that afternoon, I walked into the old Echelon headquarters. Not as an employee, not as a visitor, just as a man returning to a place that no longer held power over him. Someone else's name was on the door now. A new interim CEO brought in to stabilize the company and mitigate the damage. A damage control expert. He didn't know me. Didn't need to. I didn't stop. I didn't knock on old doors or peer through glass walls. I just walked the perimeter once, breathing in the sterile, lemon-scented air of a company trying desperately to pretend it wasn't bleeding. There were whispers in the halls. Familiar faces glanced at me, then looked away. Not in shame, just recognition. Like they knew I had seen the inside of the storm and walked out unburned. Outside, I stood on the same sidewalk where I had once carried my laptop in silence, fired by the woman I built a future with. Back then, I felt erased. Now, I felt whole. I took the long way home, not because I had anything to prove, but because the air was crisp and I had time. Time to reflect. Time to breathe. Time to finally believe that I was free. And the funny thing? I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Brielle. Not at Myra. Not even at myself. Because for all the destruction they tried to bring into my life, they also gave me something I couldn't have discovered otherwise. A reminder that power taken by force can always be taken back. But power earned through integrity, resilience, and relentless truth? That's unshakable. Let the headlines keep circling. Let the analysts debate the fall. Let the investors reassign their loyalties. As for me, I wasn't watching anymore. I was building. And every brick, every line of code, every honest conversation with my team was a new beginning. A beginning no one could take from me. Not again. The wind was gentler than usual that morning, cool, dry, tugging at my coat as I stood across the street from Echelon's old headquarters. The sun had just climbed over the skyline, throwing soft gold light across the upper windows. There was a new logo above the entryway now, sleek, minimalist, expensive. A name I didn't recognize, some acquired brand with no soul behind it, just a placeholder until the building reinvented itself again. I didn't cross the street, didn't get any closer than the sidewalk. I didn't need to. This was no longer my war zone. No longer the place where I'd ground my fingers against a keyboard at 2 in the morning to salvage another earnings report. No longer the stage for whispered betrayals, for watching the woman I loved slowly twist into someone I didn't recognize. No longer the pedestal I once stood on, only to find the foundation had been rotting beneath me. I took one last look at the building, then turned away. Closure didn't need fireworks. My new office was 5 blocks east, modest, intentionally underdesigned, tucked inside a repurposed industrial building with exposed brick and coffee-stained floors. You had to buzz twice at the entrance and walk past a bookstore to find it. That was how I wanted it. No marble, no nonsense. Inside, my team was already working. Damon was on a call in the open meeting space, a notebook full of scribbles in his lap. Marin was half sitting on a desk, chewing a pin cap while reviewing wireframes with one of the developers. Everyone was moving, alive, humming with energy, not because someone was watching, but because they believed in what we were building. Because they had a stake in it. A voice in it. That's what Nova had become, not just a product, not just a platform, but a philosophy. And the difference was this. People weren't afraid to speak here. I walked past the coffee machine, dropped my bag on my desk, and slid open the drawer. Inside was a pen. Nothing fancy. Just a black matte fountain pen I'd bought for myself the day the Nova acquisition closed. I hadn't used it yet. Until now. I pulled out the folder on my desk, something I'd been working on for weeks in the background. The roadmap for Nova 2.0. It wasn't about expanding the client base or maximizing margins. It was about evolution, about widening the scope of what behavioral analytics could do, using it not just to understand consumer patterns, but to help people make decisions that aligned with their values, their mental health, their long-term goals. A partnership between AI and agency, not manipulation, collaboration. I clicked the pen open and signed the top page with a quiet stroke of ink. My name, my vision, not hers. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the hum of the office settle around me like a second skin. This wasn't what I thought success would look like. It wasn't penthouses or headlines. It was peace. It was walking into a space and not bracing for impact. It was not checking the door twice, not wondering who was whispering behind your back or pulling the strings just out of view. It was knowing that the people around you weren't afraid to say your name out loud. That you could be human here, flawed, evolving, but present. A knock sounded at my glass wall. I turned. Damon stood there, holding up 2 coffees and an envelope. "Mail for you," he said, stepping inside. I took the coffee with a nod and opened the envelope. It was from my attorney. Inside, final confirmation that the last remnant of my IP dispute had been closed, sealed, and settled. No residual claims. No litigation pending. My name, officially and permanently, was attached to every line of code that built Nova. And Echelon? They'd signed the licensing agreement for retroactive use just 1 hour before the statute ran out. Quietly. No press release. No statement. They folded the same way they rose, strategically, surgically, without apology. Damon watched me read it, eyebrows raised. "Good news. The best kind," I said. "The kind that doesn't need to be shouted." He grinned and tapped the coffee cup. "You know, this whole thing's been kind of cinematic." I smirked. "You've been watching too many documentaries." "I mean, come on," he said. "Guy gets blindsided by his wife, fired from his own company, disappears for a while, and then comes back swinging with something better. That's a screenplay waiting to happen." I shrugged. "It's just life." He looked around the office, at the team scribbling on whiteboards and typing through meetings, then back at me. "You really don't feel like rubbing it in?" "Why?" I said. "They already know. And I'm not writing this story for them anymore." He nodded slowly, then turned to leave. "Still, if you ever need someone to play you in the movie, let me know. I've been practicing my calm but devastating monologues." I laughed. A real one. When he left, I turned back to the window, my fingers running along the edge of the signed page. I thought back to the man I was that day Brielle called. The man who stared out an office window, blindsided, heartbroken in two, told by the woman he trusted most that he was disposable. That man didn't exist anymore. I didn't want him back. I was the man with the pen now. The man who rewrote the ending. And more importantly, the one writing the next chapter. Not for revenge. Not for approval. But for peace. For purpose. Because I learned the hard way, success isn't about proving people wrong. It's about finally remembering who you are and choosing to be that person every damn day without asking for permission. Outside, the city pulsed on. But inside, I was still. Whole. And this time, I held the pen.